This is not a democracy. This is not a place where everybody gets a vote and the greatest vote wins. That is not how a great team runs. A leader still has to make decisions. A leader still has to say, this is what we're doing because this is what I see as the right way to go.
I'm feeling targeted right now. What are you trying to say?
I still need to know what specifically are you working on. Not the details, the implementation notes, things like that, but what does it look like? And sometimes the results were quite horrifying. You have zero either maintenance type work or tech debt or improvements, enhancements that go to our strategy, and it's all business features.
What does good look like? What is your north, and what's your technology roadmap? Where are you going with this service or this application? As an app manager, you need to make sure you're maintaining a 6-month, 12-month, 24-month view of what this app is going to look like into the future.
Welcome to Tech Council, your go-to podcast for mastering the art of building in the enterprise world. Join hosts Duncan and Jason Ehmke as they unpack the strategies, tools, and insights you need to drive innovation at scale. Brought to you by DevGrid, we're here to empower developers, tech leaders, and enterprise builders. Hit subscribe, and let's dive into today's episode. We're back into this and kind of excited about the topic today. It's near and dear to our hearts, both as DevGrid and also from our histories and careers is talking about ownership in the application world and how you can be a good app leader and owner of that stuff. So I want to immediately kick it over to you. You got something you want to share, and then we'll get into the topic more broadly.
Yeah, when I've led teams, the biggest thing for me is just to keep reading and always be an avid reader. And one of those books that has always been standing out to me, and I recommend it often, is Turn the Ship Around. It's about a submarine captain who starts off lower in the rungs, and his big thing was, don't ask for permission, tell me what you're doing. And so I want to start with a passage on that. It starts with, one of the things that limits our learning is our belief that we already know something. My experience on the Will Rogers convinced me there was something fundamentally wrong with our approach. Simply exhorting people to be proactive, take ownership, be involved, and all the other aspects of an empowerment program just scratched the surface. It was only after serving on the Will Rogers that I opened myself up to new ideas about leadership. I began to seriously question the image of the sea captain as master and commander. I began to wonder whether everything I'd been taught about leadership was wrong. I'm going to jump forward. It is precisely the success of the top-down leader-follower structure that makes it so appealing. As long as you are measuring performance over the short run, it can be effective. Officers are rewarded for being indispensable, for being missed after they are. When the performance of a unit goes down after an officer leaves, it is taken as a sign that he was a good leader, not that he was ineffective in training his people properly. Another factor that makes this leadership approach appealing is the induced numbness. It absolves subordinates of the hard work of thinking, making decisions, and being responsible and accountable. You are just a cog, an executor of the decisions of others. Hey, I was only doing what I was told. People get comfortable with this. There's a cost to people, though, which only becomes evident over time. People who are treated as followers treat others as followers when it's their turn to lead. A vast untapped human potential is lost as a result of treating people as followers. Only in the long run, 3 to 10 years later, does it become obvious. But by that time, people have moved on to new jobs. And so I've been guilty of this. I've been guilty myself of taking on a new position. And I remember one instance where I was recently promoted to a director of engineering. And one of the first days of the job, I was in the stand-up. I still wanted to be close and understand what the teams were working on. But where I stepped in it is that I started to run the stand-up. People were getting a little off course and discussing things that weren't really necessary part of the stand-up. I immediately jumped in and started to steer everybody back on their course. But that's what I felt I should be doing. The team isn't executing properly on this, and so I am the leader. I should take over. It was only afterwards when I got a scathing email from the person I had put in charge. Now, I don't agree with his approach, but the message was clear, is that you put me in this position for a reason. Give me the space to run my team the way I think. And there's a lot of nuances there, and I'm not going to pretend that that's a proper way to talk to your superior in an organization. But his message was very clear, is that I misstepped. I should have given the team the space to run the stand-up. and given him the feedback afterwards of how to run his team. And that stuck with me for a long time. And this has been years since that has happened, but I still remember the fact that I put somebody into position for a reason. I need to give them the space to make decisions and also to make mistakes.
Yeah, no, I remember that. I remember that situation. That was fun. I mean, I think we've all been there, right? To your point, like it's the classic conundrum of, hey, I'm really good at this thing. That's why I got promoted. And then you keep doing that thing. And then you have to unlearn, as your organizational scope changes or your role changes, it's not just your skills. You don't just get to apply your skills the way you've always done it, right? Like you have to recognize. So in that context with those guys, it was, great. You can run a great stand up, but actually your job isn't to run a great stand up anymore, right? Like your job is to help this guy become great at running a great stand up. And very few people make that transition seamlessly, right? Like you learn by failing and you're like, oh shoot, yeah, I shouldn't have done that, it's not trivial, right? Like, and that's part of leadership is understanding your context and your role, right? Because I think when you're the team lead of a space, like just staying with that example, right? When you're the team lead of a space, what you're responsible for is obviously you're responsible for getting work done, making sure the code is good, making sure the team is, oriented properly and is, working well together and all of those different things. But as you move up into like a director app manager level where you might have 5 or 10 of those teams under you, obviously you still have that responsibility kind of, but it's more of a meta thing where now you're going into a more abstract, you're more outcome oriented, right? As you go further up the hierarchy, the outcomes matter more than the inputs, right? And the processes and the activities, right? So at the lower level, it's like, hey, am I doing the right stuff? Am I, shipping the code, shipping the thing, versus at the outcome level for sort of an app manager. So yeah, I mean, it's a great call out, and we see it all the time where I would kill for an app manager to even make that mistake, right? When I watch some of these people we work with and some of the groups that we talk to and different things, you see just such an abject lack of ownership taking, whereas you're talking about someone who's taking too much ownership in the sense of like not letting the team do its thing and thrive. Whereas, I'm normally trying to pull on the opposite end of that string to get people to take more ownership and more accountability and all that. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Well, I'm thankful he gave me that feedback. I'm thankful that he and I were able to build that rapport, that he felt that he could give me the feedback that he felt I needed to not continue to make those mistakes. Now, if I'm going to fast forward in that scenario where he didn't, I could have been continuing to run the organization from a very top-down approach. And what else would I have been missing had I continued to do that? Because you've got a finite number of hours in a day of things that you should care about. And if I'm continuing to care about the lower level details of how a stand-up is run, it's a silly example, but the point is that you take yourself up 1 or 2 levels above that. And, you're not just an app manager anymore. You're leading app managers, and you're caring about how they're prioritizing certain tasks. That's too low level for you and not prioritizing on the outcomes that you need to see and run the organization. There's a lot of the other strategic points. I think you had brought this up beforehand of, if you're not making the decisions that you need to make as a higher manager, what else are you leaving on the table that you should be caring about?
Yeah, no, I mean, for sure. I think it's tricky. I think you make a good point too, though, right? Like it's very easy to get offended when one of your subordinates kind of comes back at you on, complaining about some way you're operating, right? Like whatever. In this case, you gave a good example. I think the takeaway or the encouragement I'd give is, give your subordinates a ton of latitude in the way that they give you feedback, right? And really look for it and treat it as super valuable, and don't get have thick skin. Don't get offended. They're going to do it badly most of the time, right? Like if they were really good at giving feedback to their boss, they might have your job, right? Like it's you have to recognize where people are at
and they're going to do it badly, and to not take that personally. Obviously, if it's insubordinate and if it's in an environment that requires you to respond to it in a certain way, that's a different thing. So there is a limit to what I'm saying. But generally speaking, like, understand that it's frustrating for them too, and they're trying, give them, what's the term is, assume positive intent, right? And even, like, to your point, that guy was a good dude. He didn't do it well, but because you didn't take it personally and you didn't get all offended by it, it ended up being a positive thing. And these types of moments are generally opportunities for it to be a better understanding of each other and for things to continue to grow and sort of do better. So I think that's a kind of a key takeaway from that.
Yeah, and it's even new developers coming onto a team, new leads, that I always find that default is to ask permission for things. Can I do this? Can I use this? Can I use that? And eventually I had to just call it all hands and say, stop asking for permission. This is not the organization that we work in. I'm not here to grant permission for you to use things. I need to be informed of your thoughts and what you're looking to do, but we're not here to ask permission for making decisions. If I have to make all your decisions for you, I'm going to do your job for you, and it's going to take longer, but we'll just get some contractors to just chunk out code. But that's not who we are here. We're here to take ownership of things. Tell me what you're working on. Tell me why you want to do it. Tell me the value of it, and we can agree together on if this is a path forward. But I think kind of gets into another perspective of this is to be okay with saying okay. Now, we all have heard about the power of saying no, power of saying no, power of saying no, but I think there's also a lot of the power of saying okay. I might not agree with the way you're doing it, but okay.
I'm feeling targeted right now. What are you trying to say? No, but let's pull that thread, right? Because I think there's a dichotomy here, right? Like, this is how do you, I agree with what you're saying conceptually, right? Like, you want people to take ownership. You want people to be thoughtful. You want people to take a forward foot stance of, here's the change I want to implement, and understand where the boundaries are of that, right? And always be kind of pushing it by 5%, right? And now that requires a lot of coaching. That requires a lot of context and all those different things. And so it's hard, knowing where those boundaries are is a very hard thing for people. And they tend to give up on finding it once they bounce against it a couple times. That kind of like, fine, just tell me what to do. I don't want to think anymore, because they get sick of that situation, which, is a pretty normal human thing. To put it back in kind of a question form, like, how do you balance giving people some how do you balance autonomy versus standardization, for lack of a better term, right? Like this is something we deal with our product. People come to us to use DevGrid because they're like, hey, we're using 700 different solutions over, like, everybody's bespoke. We need to get a view of it and then start to, reconcile some of these things. How do you, as a leader, how do you balance those things?
Yeah, I think standardization, there's a lot of power there, but I also think there's a lot of pitfalls to saying we must use these tools because these are the standards. And, I always used to tell my teams, aim for perfection, but have an acceptable tolerance for deviations. And in this case, perfection would be to fit all the standards. I am using, in our case, our quote unquote standard is we're using TypeScript, we're using React, we're using very serverless tools. These are our standards, but as we've seen, we have to deviate from the standards for very good reasons. We're not just using the newest and latest and greatest thing. We're using tools intentionally to better fit the need. So now to your question of how do you balance that is, you don't always have to balance it and fit the standards because these are what the standards say. If your team can justify, here's what I want to do, here's why I want to do it, here's how it still meets the targets of what we're looking for. Okay. My answer has always been okay. And, I might push at that to your point of, well, how does it solve this? How does it solve that? Now, generally, I'm a curious person to want to know how they're meeting those conclusions. And now maybe they have those thought processes need to be adjusted. But I'm going to ask questions about that. But as long as all the checkboxes are met, they're delivering on the targets. Okay.
So let me paint a different scenario. Like, because we're in a startup environment, it's a little different, right? Our scale is different and things like that. But we think about, you and I were both recently at a Fortune 500 bank, right? Like, and they had some diversity of stack, to be sure. And it would very often sort of devolve into religious wars, effectively, right? On what's better. And you had the .NET people over here, you had the Java people over here, you had the, newer stuff over, in another group. And, but ultimately, my conclusion from that type of an environment is it requires top-down leadership to evoke change, and you have to be more strict than perhaps you're articulating in order to get people aligned and going in a single direction that's productive, which isn't ideal, right? Like you'd prefer autonomy and be able to, talk about design principles and all these different things and have people coalesce around something. But the reality is that's very, very challenging to actually have happen, because people are set in their ways and they're comfortable with what they're comfortable with. And, I can think of another transition, like the transition to React Native from, native code was a very top down, this is what it's going to be and whatnot. And so what are your thoughts on that? Like reconciling, do you think, both of those situations that I'm talking about, right? Like, do you think that was ultimately necessary, or do you think there was a third path through? And then just talk about those sort of trade-offs in general, and when you're at a certain scale, like how that impacts the way you approach these things.
Well, if I remember, React Native part is that it was pitched on a lot of benefits. You're pitching the benefits. You're pitching the one code base to deploy both Android and iOS. It's speed, it's efficiency, it's hiring benefits. You can have one UI framework that is imported into both, and you have speed and efficiency. So, right. And so you're not just selling a technology there, you're selling outcomes. You were selling the outcomes of using something. And so, well, you're backing into it and saying, well, how are we going to meet that? I've just sold outcomes. I can't meet those targets with native code anymore. I must then, based off of the agreed upon outcomes of improved delivery, improved even security, improved focus, improved speed to market. I can't do that anymore with using native code. Too complicated. My hiring has to completely change back to more traditional of, I need an Android developer, I need an iOS developer. And you can't meet those targets anymore. So you have to then fundamentally change how you're approaching solving these problems by saying, okay, well, React Native is the thing that makes the most sense here because I can meet those targets from using a different technology. So you can look at it a couple different ways, but it really boils down to how am I going to meet those improved targets? Because otherwise, a lot of other bigger decisions were going to be made. I have to use React Native now because this is the way the market's shifting.
Ultimately, though, what that did was that boxed into teams, right? Like the teams didn't have a choice at that point. And so I want to and I mean, to your point, I spearheaded that, right? Like I was in charge of the mobile platform. I pushed that strategy up the chain to get buy-in, both from them, both my leadership in the business, and then our boss, my boss at the time, really, he was the one that ultimately made that decision and then pushed it forward, on a very strong recommendation from me. And then we implemented that throughout his entire organization. But I mean, people quit over it, right? I don't want to steal too much because we are going to have a guest that's going to come talk about this. So we don't want to go too much on the React Native stuff. But the point being, it's like there are situations where that autonomy is just not compatible with the wider strategy.
Well, this is not democracy. You made this point to me before, and it's just stuck in my head for a long time. And I'm not going to say the exact quote because I remember the quote, but this is not a democracy. This is not a place where everybody gets a vote and the greatest vote win. That is not how a great team runs. Is a leader still has to make decisions. A leader still has to say, this is what we're doing because this is what I see as the right way to go. Now, that's just a different perspective, a different level in the chain, is that you made the decision because you knew it was the right way to go. You don't have to have the teams agreeing with you. Obviously, you got the input. You wouldn't have made the decision if it was 100% no vote. Now, but it worked though. That's the thing, is that if it didn't work, well, then maybe next time you would have made a different decision.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, the life cycle of these types of technology choices is really interesting. I think that one of the other things to kind of keep in mind as a leader, as you think about important technology decisions, is to have a humility to them, because you have imperfect information both about the current ecosystem. Usually, you can't know everything, but then also you don't know what the world's going to look like in 12, 24, 36 plus months, right? And I think we've talked about this on the podcast. I certainly have talked about it many times, right? The time value of these decisions, a decision made in 1995 from an architectural standpoint is an insane decision usually in 2025, right? Because everything's changed so much. It may have been the smartest call back in 95 or even 2015, in 2025, that's just silly, that same decision, right? And people still operate with those paradigms. And I've seen it over and over again where people won't change their minds because they made a decision 3 to 5 years ago and they don't want to do anything that would, in their minds, invalidate that decision and or allow someone to criticize that decision extra because, oh, look, you're doing this now, which is just bananas and silly thinking. And I think, and the reason I think of, that brought to my mind was, we had the same conversation when we were at Passport around should we go to React Native, because we were doing a full rewrite. Even I and you came in like we were already like 3/4 through the rewrite, but I really kind of felt strongly, not strongly, but it seemed to me like that's where things were going, and that was the right call. I let two things keep me from doing it then. One was I don't think the React Native stuff was quite ready, and because what we were doing at Passport, we felt like we needed closer to the metal, effectively, access, like because we might be doing some weird stuff with Bluetooth beacons and like all these other things where we thought we'd want more OS expertise. I think ultimately that didn't actually end up mattering. But that was part of it. And then also the team, we had actually built a really good team of iOS and Android devs that would have revolted, right? Like completely revolted. And like the guy that was the head of mobile would have quit and all those other things. And so I backed off and I was like, okay, fine, let's just keep going with the path that you guys had already laid down and we'll go forward. Ultimately, I don't think that was the best thing for the company. Now, I think it was the best decision I could make at that time because of that and other reasons. But I took that with me into the other conversation, and I was slightly more willing to be unpopular because I saw that had caused me to back down in a way that ultimately wasn't productive previously. And so it's, like I said, these things, you have to give yourself some grace because you are who you are when you approach the situation with the information that you have, and you do the best you can. And then also, like I said, have some humility about it all. But
so let's get into that for a second, because before we kicked off, and you had brought up a good point of obviously you're pushed for timelines as an app manager, as a lead, as a at any level of the organization, you're pushed to meet timelines. And so in the facet of owning your delivery, owning your application, say, how do you make sure that you're not to that example before, you kept going down the native path and now you've built up so much either bad decisions, shortcuts, and now 50%, 75% of your roadmap is now dealing with tech debt that should have been handled along the way. So how do you then look at that and say, well, we've made some decisions, we messed up, how do we fix this?
Yeah, I mean, it's getting away from the native thing because again, I don't want to steal Chris's thunder, and I think it's also kind of a tricky one. But I know of an integration, for example, like there's an M&A at a company, and they were allowed to operate pretty independently for half a decade, even after the M&A, and it really caused a lot of issues in this area. So I'll kind of use them as an example, without naming names, because there's good people there. I don't want to throw spears at them. It just there was a lot of patterns that sort of happened to them that they also participated in, but that kind of today leave them in a sticky place, right? So to your question, I would frame it, I would ask, restating your question a different way, how do you balance the overall health and quality of your application with business delivery pressure, right? Like that's how I would kind of frame. Is that a fair framing?
Yeah. Well, thank you for rephrasing my question, but yes.
Well, just for myself, so it's like where I start is, and I've had this conversation with many app managers, that some that worked for me, some that I was peers with, some that were I was asked to go and help coach. Where I start is you are accountable for the outcomes, the technical outcomes of your applications. No one else is accountable. Reminds me of one of my favorite movies from like the mid 2000s. There was The Kingdom of Heaven. It's about the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the war with Saladin, and the king of Jerusalem who's got leprosy. So it's actually Ed Norton, and he's got like this silver mask on him, and he says, I'm gonna butcher the quote, but it was basically something like, when you stand before the gates, you cannot say, but I was told by thus to do so, right? At the end of your life, it's like you're accountable for your choices and what you do. And so, when you get to a place where you're now drowning in tech debt and you're having to spend 50, 60, 70% of your capacity plus on purely technical outcomes. Like that's not a good place to be. And you can't say, well, it's the business's fault. They wouldn't let us do this work. Now that there may be some truth to that, but like I start from a place of, well, for one, you just don't point the finger. You're being a victim as a leader is almost never the right move. In fact, I would go so far as never to say never the right move. Take accountability for your part in it. Now, if you just inherited something, obviously that's a different animal, but ultimately it's like, no, if you've been in that seat for more than 6 months, you own the outcome, you own the result. And so there's a mentality that you have to take that says, okay, hey, business, I understand you have this desire to get this XYZ thing out. We have to chip away at these problems or we're going to have a bigger problem. Now, what's happening with those guys in particular, I think, is they struggle to make incremental progress. And so this gets into the how you fix tech debt and quality and things like that. We've all seen it, right? Like the engineer, like, oh, we got to do a full rewrite. I got to refactor this whole thing, right? Like, because I just don't like it, or it's going to be better if we do this. And I mean, you and I get into it about refactors. It's a fun topic, but because my code's very spaghetti and yours is very much not the other way. And so there's a time and place for those types of things, but the better, especially in an enterprise environment where you've got big systems and or lots of microservices and things like that, is figuring out ways to make incremental progress, right? And that if you can make incremental progress, then what you can do is you can say, okay, hey, we're going to apply a certain percentage of our capacity constantly to making incremental progress and identifying what our tech debt is, whether it's security related or just keeping things up to date or architectural issues. I think the biggest thing, back to the question though, is like the biggest thing is you have to recognize it's your responsibility. There's no little cavalry or fairy that's going to come along and sprinkle extra time into the ecosystem for you to go and make things better. That's your job. Like that's why an app manager exists, is to balance the business strategy and the technical strategy and to be the voice for the technology and to make sure it stays healthy. So if you're struggling to get, like, again, you can't go and be ridiculous and say we need to spend half of our time on one and half of our time on the other. Somewhere between 10 to 20, maybe if it's a really complicated space, 30% of your capacity should go towards those things. And that should be plenty. You should, if you do that well and you apply that, maintenance type work to things that are actually meaningful, that should be enough, I would say. And so, but it's your job to fight for that. And if you have to make a trade-off on the short term, it's your job to make sure that trade-off is well understood, that your business partners are very invested in that reality and the trade-offs that's being made and are signing up for a cleanup later, right? So you could say, hey, we're going to kick this can down the road in Q1, but in Q2, I'm grabbing this much capacity to clean it up, right? Or something like that. And you get that kind of contract in writing to some, I mean, it's not contract, but like an email and a paper trail. So people don't forget all those things, or some sort of record of decision or something like that. That's how I would usually think about it. I mean, I don't know if you have different thoughts.
Now, what's your approach here on this? Because let me give you a scenario. And I do dip my toes, or I used to dip my toes back into the sprint plans for the teams. I would just do maybe once a month, go and spot check. What are they working on? Because I still need to know what specifically are you working on, not the details, the implementation notes, things like that, but what does it look like? And sometimes the results were quite horrifying, that you have zero either maintenance type work or tech debt or improvements, enhancements that they go to our strategy, and it's all business features. And so I say, hey, help me understand what's going on here, because I'm not seeing anything that is meeting our strategic targets. It's 100% feature driven work. It's difficult for some leads or some app managers to grasp that I need to hold the line. I must hold the line of the onslaught of feature work, because there's always feature work. How do they balance it? And so we got into ongoing discussions of, tell me what you're working on as far as your non-feature work. What's your tech strategy? What's your plan? What's your priorities? And so it got them into the more of a regimen of thinking of, okay, I do have capacity. I do have numbers. They started to partition out their time and balance it. Maybe there's, maybe one sprint was lighter on some of this tech maintenance work or tech debt. The other one was really heavy, but in the end, the the ratio is balanced out. But what has been your approach there? Because that worked for me. That worked for my leads. Is just giving them a data-driven approach. But I know that doesn't work for everybody.
Well, no, I think what I was going to say is something. You have very specific implementation, but ultimately, I think what you have to do is putting some data around it's super helpful, right? Or maybe another way to say that is, and we used to talk about this all the time, right? Like, what does good look like, right? Like, what is your north, like, and what's your technology roadmap, right? Like, where are you going with this service or this application, right? Like, or this capability with maybe, right? Like maybe you've got a business capability that you're providing. Maybe it's auth, right? Okay, cool. I'm doing the IAM, the customer IAM stuff for an application. Where are you going? Like, you're doing work, but as an app manager, you need to make sure you're maintaining a 6-month, 12-month, 24-month view of what this app is going to look like into the future, both from a capability standpoint, like what are the things that you plan to build into it, and then also from what are your gaps that need to get better. And there's a few categories, right? There's the security stuff, right? Like there's constantly new issues popping up that from the scans that you just need to, generally speaking, it just means you need to go upgrade libraries, right? Like that's usually the issue. So you got to keep that stuff up to date. You've got to keep your end of life. You got to make sure your underlying software, whether it's an OS or server or whatever runtime of some kind is currently supported. And, those are like kind of non-negotiables that actually tend to sneak up on people. It's one of the reasons we put it in a dev grid to help people. Like, you have 75 days, you have 74 days, you have 73 days, like put it in their face a little bit more. But, so you need that data. You need to know what it is. You got the non-negotiable stuff. Then there's going to be a big swath of amorphous, like small improvements that could be made that are hard to quantify the benefit of, but you kind of like, they're the type of thing that the engineers sort of know that need to be done. Like, oh, I need to kind of change the way this cache is, or like, there's all kinds of like performance optimizations or like maybe a bug or that type of thing that are sitting out there that are maybe causing customer issues, maybe not, but maybe could. Like, so there's usually a long list of semi-important but not urgent, like, quality of life improvements that could be done to a service or to an application. And then the other category, it's kind of in that one, but I would call it out as a separate category, is things like around observability, right? And operations, right? Like, so what are the gaps operationally? Because I this, and we come from sort of a background and a philosophy that says you build it, you run it, right? And so this thing that tends to happen in companies where it's like it's kind of like the front office and the back office or the front of the house and back of house at a restaurant. You got like the wait staff that has to deal with the customers and deal with all the issues that pop up, and then you got the kitchen, and like they never cross streams really. And so you just throw it over the wall. I don't believe in throwing it over the wall. So as an application team, you should be constantly also evaluating your operational success and looking for opportunities there. So like those are kind of the categories that I would see, and then document the stuff, right? Like, we have all these tools that drive everybody crazy, whether it's Jira or whatever SDLC tool you use. And everybody talks and complains about them. Mostly, I think, because it's just this list of crap that just never ends. And so it's just, you feel like the guy, I forget the Greek thing that you're pushing the stone up the hill and it just rolls back down every night. Like, I think there's a psychological resentment that sort of builds up over time because of that. But just document it. Like, document it and tag it. I just took 5 minutes or whatever to say basically that, right? Document and tag everything. Give yourselves a few different categories. You use categories I just mentioned, right? Like security, must-haves, general improvement, observability, and operational improvement, right? Like, it could be that simple, and tag it, and then just look at how many tickets, how many points or hours or whatever capacity number you use is getting consumed by that. And to your point, like, make sure it's not zero. Make sure there's a range that's acceptable over a certain period of time. And to your point, it doesn't have to have in every sprint, but make it visible, and then make it and measure what's good as well on the other end, right? So have an outcome orientation. We saw this at Ally, right? Like, we had an SRE practice that would find issues in applications and ask the teams to deal with it, and they just wouldn't, because it was never important enough, right? And so But what we did that solved the problem was we just created a reporting methodology that surfaced that reality. Hey, you've got Jason, your team has 10 requests from SRE to either add logging or do this thing or do whatever the thing was. And you're aging on these requests. You have 5 that are over 90 days old. You have 3 that are 60 to 90 days. And that was literally all we had to do. And the problem went away within like 2 months. Like everybody burned that list down because it was just out of sight, out of mind for them. And so to me, that proved data is the answer. Put it in front of people and say, this is what good is. This is where you are. And again, this is why we built maturity journeys the way we built maturity journeys into DevGrids. Like, what is good? How do we get there? And people just will naturally try to achieve, right?
And I think also we need to assign specific owners to certain practices, right? Who owns what? Who is the throat to choke on planning? Who is the throat to choke on managing tech debt? Who's the person making decisions on what goes into a roadmap, what goes into a sprint? And I've actually had some pretty contentious discussions on exactly that, because either somebody didn't want to do it or somebody really wanted to do it who shouldn't be responsible for that. And so that's when you see maybe product, business, or engineering. I mean, there's even roles within that. It's that who's making decisions on what goes where, and everybody either wanted to or didn't want to do it. And so making sure there's clear lines in the sand of who is making decisions actually goes a long way to say, hey, this is so-and-so's responsibility. If they're not here, well, let's have a discussion. But you know, they are deciding what goes into a sprint. This person is deciding what goes into a roadmap in collaboration with another individual. And so having those clear lines of, you are making decisions here. If you've made a bad decision, well, you and I are going to talk about that. Like if you've made something that you didn't deliver on time, I'm going to have a conversation with my lead to say, why did you make the decision? As long as there's a justifiable reason for it, well, fine. But oftentimes there's no clear roles and responsibility of who's doing what, who is supposed to be taking ownership. And if there's not, it's just somebody's going to grab it. I've seen oftentimes where there's a team who's just delivering a lot of features, but they're now slowly delivering less features and less features and less features because they've let all this technical debt build up that, you know, well, I can't deliver this because of this. I can't deliver because of that. But if you put that technical person back in charge of making decisions of what they're delivering on, yeah, they're still going to deliver the features, but they're also going to start caring more about how they're delivering it, not just that they're delivering things.
Yeah, I mean, it varies from organization to organization, right? Like, I think you make a point that's universal, though, right? Like, say it another way, is when there are good understandings of the boundaries and the ownership of the decision, a much better debate can be had, a much healthier debate that can be had. The best debates I've ever had, and the most progress, in many ways, the most influential I've ever been able to be, were in situations where I wasn't the decision maker, and it was clear I wasn't the decision maker. But because those boundaries were clear, I was able to push. It's like, I know ultimately this is your call. Here's my articulation of why you should do what I think you should do. There's a whole strategy to that too. But like in the context of a team and deciding what work should happen, yeah, I think generally speaking, I think you and I both agree that generally speaking, the team lead is the person who should be putting work in the sprint. They're the ones that decide what goes in the sprint and what doesn't. You know, your business or product partner are the ones that prioritize the work from a business lens, right? Like this is what, whatever methodology they're using, could be finger in the air, could be weighted shortest job first. There's all kinds of different scoring methodologies. Whatever it is, that's their job, is to say, here's 1 to N importance based upon business priority and size and all those things. And then it's technology's job to break that work down and execute against it at the sprint level. That's a personal opinion as to the best way to do it. Depends. Your results may vary based on the culture of the organization and the skills. Like if you have a highly technical product management practice, like maybe Google or somebody like that, maybe it's a little different, right? Like maybe that's a different thing. In which case, maybe that person's kind of the team lead. It's unclear how those actually work in practice. But I've never actually been somewhere where that actually worked. Everywhere I've been, you've got somebody making business decisions, somebody making technology decisions, and then they sort of negotiate it out. But it's clear the technology person needs to be the one that actually makes the decision. And in terms of to your point, they're going to be the best informed about what makes sense from a sequencing standpoint, what makes sense from a capacity with their individual team. Jimmy's out, Stephanie's got extra time, whatever it is. And then also folding in the maintenance, care, and feeding work that needs to happen. So generally speaking, I was trained. I kind of came up with a leader that his thinking was always take accountability for everything as much as you possibly can. And so he would grab accountability because, and the criticism of that was he would be considered, well, he's controlling. He has to own it in order to do it and all those different things. And I see that point of view, but I also see over and over and over again the benefit of if you take responsibility for the thing, you can actually make it better. And so, that's the default for me is always just take responsibility for it and assume it's your responsibility to make it happen. And then understand where it's not. And then, but, respect the boundaries of, hey, this is your decision, but let me push where I think is appropriate. So that's probably the piece that I would go with.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And kind of to sum this up is that there's plenty of people who don't know accountability, who need to be, I guess, told that you are accountable for these things. And unless you've had some of those conversations of clearing the lines of roles, responsibilities, who's in charge of what, who's making decisions on what, you're asking for chaos. And you're asking for, a roadmap that just doesn't deliver. Because you might in the next 6 months be delivering things. And, hey, this is great, but I can pretty much guarantee that in a year, 2 years, that you'll get to the point where you slow to a crawl.
There's so many cliche things in business management that, there's so many that are useless, but like so many things that like RACI diagrams, right? Responsible, for those of you who don't know what a RACI diagram, it's basically a spreadsheet effectively that where you create a list of actions or activities, and then you define who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and who's informed as a group. It's one of our favorite tools when we're working with teams because they just, it's, to your point, it's chaos, right? Like, and it's such a cliche thing. You're like, oh, it's such consultant speak. Where's your McKinsey bag or whatever? And I get that criticism and fully endorse it. But at the same time, there's a reason some of these things become cliches is because they are so gosh darn useful, right? Like just having that conversation around, and also the nuance between responsible and accountable, right? Like those are very different things. And even though they sound the same and depends on how people interpret them and all those different things. But, and I'll give, since I said that, I'll give a very brief, like the way I see it, the way I've always looked at it is accountable is not necessarily the one doing the job. So I'll give you like SRE versus an app team. For example, like an application needs to be, resilient and highly available, right? That is the application team's responsibility to make sure they build it properly, do all the things necessary to do that. However, the SRE team, although they're not the ones building it, they're not the ones creating it, they're also accountable for making sure that happens, right? And so that's the difference between responsible and accountable from my perspective. And that conversation helps with nuance because that's I think a good example for that, right? Like SRE, if your whole ecosystem's a mess or a particular application's a mess, SRE needs to be accountable for that. But they don't write the code. So you need a way to distinguish the difference between the people that are responsible versus the people that are accountable. Other strategic functions like architecture is another good example. They're not responsible for much, but they're accountable for a lot, right? Versus the application teams are going to be wildly they're highly responsible because they're the ones that actually ship things that actually provide value. And so they're going to have a lot of responsibilities, not as so many accountabilities. But those types of things. It's funny how like traditional business management stuff it gets thrown out by a lot of people, especially because it's tech, it's different, or it's old and stuffy. But the fundamentals sometimes can matter a lot in org design, like how you think about org design and responsibilities and accountabilities in that context, or the incentives that those org designs create, like how that impacts technology, makes a big difference, and it's important. And you see it as we jump between these companies, right? Like you can see how the org design influences the culture of how these people think about things. Like we were just talking about this from some calls last week. Like it's crazy how some of these companies evolve and the cultures evolve, and you can see the direct lines into the org pieces.
And I think that's the takeaway for today is that having those charts, having those diagrams, having those agreements, and a commitment, it's not just an agreement, but it's a commitment to holding true to those lines and making sure that you're following those agreements. I'm asked, well, what if that person doesn't do that? Well, that's actually really important for you not to step in there, because if you are stepping in, you're masking the problem. If the person responsible is not being responsible, if you now flip your flag from accountable to responsible, you're masking the problem. I can't fix that. If you are taking over and taking control of things, that person's always going to just take a back seat. So just inform me of the deficiencies if I'm not seeing it. Let's see where our individuals, are those who are responsible, are missing the boat. Let's fix that problem, fix it permanently versus putting a Band-Aid on over and over and over again. That's how things just get chaotic, they get messy. And now you have an individual who's running the team who really shouldn't be.
Yeah, this is a really good point. You don't do other people's job. Let systems break.
Let them fail.
Yeah, let systems fail. Now, I mean, know which ones can't fail, right? Like, don't let production go down or whatever. But like, so don't overtake this. But
yeah, like, oh, I saw the incident going out, and it was their job, and I didn't tell them. Oh, that's not what we're saying. To be clear, we're not saying let production go down. Don't let a critical vulnerability go to production. Raise the alerts.
Don't create unhealthy pressure release valves, right? Because if you think, what do I mean by that? It's like pressure builds in a pipe, right? And then if it's a high pressure system, there's a valve that can release the pressure so the whole system doesn't bust, right? Well, inevitably in large organizations, there are a bazillion of those pipes running around all over each other, right? Like, there's all these processes and all, and they tend to be very organic and not very particularly well thought through and contradictory and overlapping. And there's a lot of that going on, right? Well, what ends up happening, and I've worked with people, like I had a guy, he ran release management and kind of ops for me when I was the platform lead for Allies Digital. And he was like a human pressure release valve. He would jump into situations that were completely screwed up, and he would get the temperature of the situation down to a tolerable level over and over and over again. And it was an incredibly useful skill until I realized that, oh, actually, I have to restrain you from doing this because you're preventing the organization from getting better, right? Because you're a hero, you're operating as a hero in the situation, and it's really valuable in that moment. But overall, you're hampering the improvement of the organization because you're lowering the severity of the problem low enough that people just move on from it and they don't actually fix the issue.
That's exactly what that's exactly.
Let it stay in the red line. I mean, you got to know, right? Like, I'm talking more about like stupid offline processes, not production things, but like, let it stay in the red line and don't do something heroic to fix the momentary problem. You want to fix the system, right? The systems matter, and the system can be a process. It can be, ownership. Like, maybe somebody owns something that's stupid for them to own. It should be over here, right? And you made that argument already, and then one listens to you, and it's like, okay, well, let it fail, again, within reason. Let it fail, and then you can have the conversation then. And again, you have to be careful with this type of thing, because you want to operate in the best interest of the overall organization, right? So you can't be doing like Machiavellian things to like, oh, I'm going to create the situation where these guys are going to fail, so then I can just scoop it up or something like that. You have to have the right intent. Like, I'm not trying to give someone like these manipulative techniques. My point is to say, again, what you said, just with 10 times more words, is like, don't be a hero when being a hero allows dysfunction. Be a hero to fix the dysfunction and be courageous to speak up against the dysfunction. Don't scramble around to cover it up, right? And again, nobody thinks about it that way. That's why we're saying it kind of over and over again. Is if you're the person that's constantly running with the fire hose, maybe it's better to like put some flame retardant walls up instead of constantly having to have a fire hose, right? And so, and then that's a sense of ownership. Like, the whole thing of taking ownership is your job is to care and feed for these platforms that you run and own. Think about them on the longer term, not just the immediate, and balancing those different things. And that's complicated. You got to balance a lot of different things. Nobody can tell you exactly what that looks like, other than, You're better off if you're operating as a high agency person, which is a theme you'll hear from us a lot. So
no, I mean you're spot on though. I mean I think this all wraps up into a single thing is that know what you're accountable for, know what you have to take ownership of, and make sure that you're delivering on the things that you are responsible for without blurring those lines. And it's just being very clear and intentional with maintaining that level of ownership, and also knowing when to go a little bit lower to get the temperature, to really understand what's happening beneath the scenes here. Because if you're not dipping your toes in there, like I mentioned about looking at the sprint designs, I'm not going to know. You have to know. You have to be informed. You have to use data as the thermometer to know how are we actually doing without getting too into the weeds, without questioning my team and why'd you do this? Why'd you do that? What are you doing? What's this? What's that? Like what platforms are you using? What systems are you using? Be able to draw the line of, I'm not going to get too low level. I'm going to let them make their decisions, but measure them on the outcomes that we have agreed on. I think that makes a strong organization. I think that's what helps make a leader go from running a team to running an organization. Being able to define, where do I need to stop caring about the details and where can I step up and care about the overall direction versus the minutia.
Yeah, and that's going to be hard. That's hard. Like I know CIOs that are in those weeds, man. Like it's tough. I mean, we joke about it. Like it's hard for me with DevGrid to not be in the weeds. And so especially it's really hard. I'm gonna talk about it for myself, from my own point of view. Like it's really hard when you like have to dig into the details to sort of like do UAT, right? So you're like looking at something we're building or whatever, and I'm like, okay, how does this work? How does it work from the customer's perspective? How does it work from a strategic perspective? And then there's like something that doesn't make sense, or you kind of think, because you have to sort of grok the whole stack in order to do that. It's like, okay, cool. I just see something now in the technical implementation that doesn't make sense to me, or I would do differently or whatever. Like resisting that and understanding when to ask questions about that and when not to is actually very hard, because you have to get into the weeds in order to do the evaluation you need to do. And then like, okay, does this actually matter or not? Like it's tricky. And so, but that's the job, right? Like is understanding in any of these situations, back to kind of what you were saying, what's your role here, right? As a CIO, your role is not to pick, a coding style, right? Or anything like that. And again, I don't know anybody that actually is that ridiculous, but like, but your job is to pick the strategy, right? And make sure the strategy is the right one, right? And even like back to that React Native thing that we were talking about, or maybe a CIO level thing, maybe a better example would be something like, we're going cloud only, right? We're going to be hybrid cloud, we're going to be on-prem, we're going to be cloud only, or maybe we're going to pick a specific cloud vendor. Like that's like a CIO level decision probably. Where exactly we draw the boundaries between this application or that application. Should we use serverless versus a container? All those types of things. It's probably too low level for the CIO. And so understanding what's your role, how do I, again, to your point, what are the outcomes that I should be measuring down the stack? How far down the stack do I need to care? Generally speaking, 2 down is about, from an organizational standpoint, is about the furthest that you can really give anybody any attention, right? Because if you think about, most people have about 8 to 12 direct reports, right? So if you think about 2 down, you're talking about like 50 or 60 people, generally speaking, especially at a higher level. So like you can't really provide input to more than 40 or 50 max if you're really efficient. So that's where, 2 down anything more than 2 down tends to be pretty impossible. And so like you understand that, and okay, now how do I build a framework for, how do I communicate expectations to these people? And then, how do I hold them accountable to the outcomes that matter? So I think that's all good. And again, ownership, take these ideas, it goes, extreme ownership. I don't think we mentioned it today, although we mention it pretty much every week because it's probably our favorite business book collectively. Like extreme ownership says, I'm going to take responsibility for almost everything that happens around me. That is an oppressive thing. If someone's putting all that on you, like, hey, as the boss, I made a bad decision, it's your fault. Like that's not fair, right? But if you take it on yourself as an app manager or a team lead or wherever your role is, take as much responsibility and accountability and ownership as you can. And in a healthy way, it'll almost always be a positive thing for you.
But also have those conversations with your teams. Is that your teams need to understand where you're coming from with this. And part of back to the beginning of this conversation is the only reason why I got that feedback from the individual is that we had a good working relationship where he knew it was safe to talk to me about things that were bothering him. Again, his delivery was terrible, but the point remains is that he felt comfortable enough to tell me that this was bothering him and I should back off. But having those conversations with your direct reports and making sure that they know you're coming from a place of trust and caring about their long-term growth, and say, hey, look, this is your responsibility. You should be taking ownership of this. I'm going to take ownership of the things that fail, but if something fails, you should be taking ownership if it fails. Like, this should be something that you would care about, and making sure that you're building that rapport, building that trust, building that relationship with your direct reports to say, we all care about the same thing. The thing I care about the most is that you're taking ownership of this to make sure that we're driving towards outcomes collectively. That goes a long way. That open communication goes a very, very long way to making sure people do say, okay, cool, I'm going to take ownership. If something fails, we'll have the conversation. We'll make sure that we patch in the future, but I'm not going to be fired for making some mistakes like this. It goes a very, very long way to have open dialogues.
There's one of the better leaders I've ever worked with, and I've worked off and on with him for over a decade now. You know, one of the things about him as a leader that I always kind of find comical when I see new people work with him and stuff, and they kind of freak out. And like, what I always tell people about this guy is all he wants to know is that you understand the problem, you understand the importance of it, the relative importance of it, and that you're taking ownership of it and you're on it. That's all he actually ever wants to know. If he doesn't feel the warm and fuzzies on those three things, he will just increasingly get into your shorts and just want more and more detail and more micromanagement until he feels like you're doing those things. And people kind of, it's funny to watch people go through that for the first time, because if they haven't had a leader that does that, then it's uncomfortable. But the cool thing is with guys like him, and I think, you know, you and I have both taken cues from him on that. Or like, it's like, I think that's a lot of what we're like. Do you understand what the problem is? Like, what is actually going on here? What is the right importance? And do you have ownership of it? As a leader, that's generally kind of repeating back what you just said, sort of. It's like, that's all that really matters. And then obviously the ultimate outcome will matter, but in the middle of it, those are the things that you're checking for, right? Like, those are the leading indicators. Jason knows what's important. You understand, you know, like, this isn't a real example, but just making it up and kind of put it in a DevGrid context. Hey, we have a new feature. We've got this feature we promised to this customer. It's got to be done by this date because we have this meeting with them or this demo with them or whatever. And this customer is important because of this revenue or whatever it is. And you rock that those things are, you kind of repeat back to me that you understand all that stuff. Like, cool. I don't ask about it again, right? Like, it's like, you got it. Like I know you, like, as long as we've synced on the important variables, like, I might check in like the day before or the week before or whatever, be like, hey, are we still good for X date? But beyond that, like, we don't need to have more of a conversation about it because those things are what's clear. And I know you've got ownership of it and you'll take it. Right. And I think that's the relationship you have to have with your teams. Right. And
to kind of put that into practice here, we've got some maturity journeys to finish up here, because you do have a customer demo on Wednesday that we got to finish up.
I think I promised that before I asked, though. That was no, maybe not. I double checked. We're good. Yeah, we got to roll.
You kind of checked. You were in the same frame, but it's all good. We got work to do, though.
Yeah, it's good. So, all right, thanks everybody, and we'll talk again soon.
That's a wrap for this episode of Tech Council, brought to you by DevGrid. Thanks for joining us as we dive into building smarter solutions for the enterprise. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe, leave us a rating, and share your thoughts on X, at DevGrid Inc., or at devgrid.io. Stay tuned for our next episode where we'll explore more ways to thrive in the enterprise. Until then, keep building.